Great. Welcome back, everyone, to remote NYU Institute for Public Knowledge. We're still here. I hope you're all doing well and are healthy. I hope you are respecting our sweatpants only clothing guideline tonight. We're just looking forward to a time when we can all be together. But I guess one advantage of being here is that here is pretty expansive. So I know we have people from all over the country and maybe beyond for our conversation tonight. And it's nice to be together however we can be. Tonight, I'm really delighted to welcome back to IPK Max Besbris, who was an Institute for Public Knowledge fellow and also a PhD student in NYU sociology. And I got to work really closely with Max back in the day. And years ago, probably more than a decade now, Max came up with the idea of doing ethnographic research on real estate brokers because he knew the literature on economic culture well, and he knew the literature on cities well, and realized that we just had very little research on what actually happens when people are in the process of searching for a home, which is one of the most consequential decisions that they'll make for financial reasons, but of course also for all kinds of outcomes that have to do with their social life and their health and well-being and the fate of their children as well. So he really wanted to understand how that process works, and was able to go through the process of learning how to be a realtor, taking the courses that realtors take, and then spending time shadowing realtors in the field and watching the process of home purchasing and home selling. And his new book, Upsold, which was published this past fall from the University of Chicago Press, is really one of the most significant accounts we have to date about how that works. And Max, we're really thrilled to have you back at IPK, and we're happy to celebrate this book with you tonight. And in lieu of a toast and book signing afterwards, I'll just impress upon everyone how much we love to see you actually read the book when we're done with the event. So we'll look to see a big spike in your Amazon sales at the end of the night. That's my version of upselling. You don't even have to buy the cloth; you can just buy the paperback. So, and then we wanted to get Max in conversation with some people who know a thing or two about how housing works and about how the economy works. And we pretty much struck gold on that score. We have Ingrid Gould-Ellen, who's my colleague at NYU, professor in the Wagner School and co-director of the Furman Center. Ingrid is really one of the world's leaders in the study of urban economics and housing in particular, and has been active on the policy side and also on the research side. In New York City, in the federal government, and of course the Furman Center has just for years done brilliant work helping us understand the dynamics of the housing market. And it's not often that sociologists and economists come together and actually engage each other's ideas. But when we do, Ingrid's one of the people we like to have around because she's pretty ecumenical and open to different approaches, and has been a great collaborator for a lot of us. That's also true for our other respondent, Bob Frank, who's recently retired, a matter of days, I think, professor and economist from Cornell University, author of many wonderful books, and again, a frequent participant in IPK conversations. We just did an event for Bob's most recent book. It wasn't that long ago, Bob, was it? It feels like it was another era.
It seems like a decade ago now, Eric.
Once upon, that was probably one of the last events we had in person at IPK. And we did these crazy things like we shook hands and maybe some people hugged. And I think there was dinner in a restaurant outside. And Bob is expert in many things, including trying to understand the pressures that get set in motion in an economy when people try to mimic the spending behavior of the most affluent among us. And this kind of race to the top, which winds up generating all sorts of problems for the overwhelming majority of us, is a dynamic that he's explored extensively in his research. And so we couldn't really do better for the setup tonight. The way we're going to do this is that Max is going to speak for maybe 15 minutes or so and tell us some key themes about his book. And I've encouraged Ingrid and Bob to jump in. And even though this is a celebration, we want to raise some tough questions and think about how people in different fields and people who work on housing and the economy in different ways will react to some of the claims that Max makes based on largely ethnographic data. There's more than that in the book. And so we're going to mix it up a little bit. And then we're going to open things up to questions. You'll be able to ask questions in either the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll read them, and I'll pick some questions from Max, and we'll end sharply at 7 o'clock. So again, thank you for being here, and please give a virtual standing ovation to Max Besbris.
Thanks, Eric. First, I want to say thanks to the team at IPK, to Jess and Sam and Zari. Thank you so much for helping organize this. As Eric mentioned, IPK is a really special place in general, but for me personally, and in terms of my intellectual development and the development of this book in particular, which I wrote a lot of in summers on break from my teaching back in New York. And so hopefully sometime soon, we'll be able to get back there in person. I want to thank both Ingrid and Bob for taking the time to engage with the book and for being here. I hope they both feel, and I guess we'll see to some extent, that their kind of thinking is in this book, right? Of course, as Eric mentioned, on Ingrid's part, thinking about housing as this, key arena of stratification and this really important market where people are dividing themselves up both financially, but also really importantly spatially. And then Bob too, I hope he feels the same way, that his work on sort of interrogating these basic sort of theories and assumptions that we have about why people do the things they do in markets, make the decisions that they make. That's really the spirit to some extent of the book. And so I'm looking forward to their remarks. And then last, I want to thank Eric in particular, as he also mentioned, he knows this book pretty well, and it wouldn't exist without him for a lot of reasons. And a lot of that is, the intellectual support he gave me when I was a graduate student. But I think also just the encouragement and and friendship, right, that really makes something like this kind of possible. So I would be remiss if I didn't say thanks again, Eric, and your copy's in the mail. So for those of you who haven't actually read the book yet, don't worry. I'll give you a little bit of a rundown on what it's about. Eric mentioned, right, that there's a motivation for this book, which is, on the one hand, sort of just empirical, right, which is that, I was reading all this literature and I wasn't finding that much about real estate agents, particularly in sociology. And so I thought, well, these people seem pretty important to the housing market. They're really key to how people find houses. They're involved in about 90% of residential real estate transactions in the United States in general, right? So this really prominent actor in this market, so I was motivated. Okay, what do they do? How do they do it? And what are the consequences of their work? And then there's this other sort of motivation for the book, which is, in general, I'm really fascinated by why there's inequality in a spatial sense, why different neighborhoods are different, right? Why their resources are not the same, why something like their housing prices are not the same. And, I thought that studying real estate agents would really be an interesting way to kind of get at this broader issue that economists, sociologists, a lot of social scientists in general, and, I think just, concerned citizens often realize, right, when they're looking around at their cities and finding this, sometimes really extreme inequality. And so, that's sort of the setup for the book. And then, as Eric mentioned, it's mostly based on a lot of ethnographic data that I gathered in 2011 and 2012. And this should be qualified in a sense, right, that this is a really interesting time, I think, for the housing market in New York. Interesting in the sense that prices are exploding, right, just shooting up in the wake of the Great Recession. You're seeing these massive spikes. And so, I'm studying real estate agents, obviously, at a particular time in a particular place. And what I did was, like Eric mentioned, followed around a group of real estate agents, mostly when they were meeting with their clients, going to open houses, and really trying to pay attention to how they talked about different neighborhoods, how they talked about different housing units, and how they talked about prices, right? And what impact, right, if any, that they had on people's decision making in this market. And I also attended all these real estate licensing classes. I interviewed a bunch of real estate agents and buyers. I was really lucky that I was able to interview a fair amount of the buyers actually 4 to 5 years after they had made their purchases, kind of to get their retrospective accounts on, how did they feel about the search process? How did they feel about their real estate agents? And then the last thing, and I'll mention this, as I sort of wrap up, is I was able to run a couple of regressions, looking at the relationship between real estate agents and prices across different neighborhoods. And here's another reason to thank Ingrid, is the people who helped me with these regressions. Shout out to Jacob Faber and Gerard Torres Espinosa. I don't know if they're on here, but these are Furman Center alum who were very helpful to that extent. So that's the sort of broad picture. Real briefly, I want to take you through what are some of, I think, kind of the key findings. So the first chapter is really about how agents establish their authority over people who are looking for houses. And, on the one hand, this isn't surprising that they have so much to say. People only buy houses, if they ever buy a house, once or twice in their lifetimes. It's this really big purchase, both financially and emotionally. Real estate agents sort of appear as these experts. They're immersed in this market. They're telling you how to think about it. And so, they're appearing to us as experts, but I think they also do some things to sort of shore up that expertise in interaction. And some of these things include bashing real estate websites, right? So they tell you that Zillow's not really a great place to learn about prices, right? That you should talk to them if you want to know about how to think about what the right amount is for a particular house. They badmouth other real estate agents, right? They say that other real estate agents are nefarious and bad actors, whereas the one you're talking to is the good one who's going to serve you, and do right by you. They're kind of they tend to be a little obscurant about their own commission structure. And this is really interesting. The Justice Department actually settled a lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors just last month in December, accusing the organization of not doing a good enough job of communicating how real estate agents make money to their clients. And this is something that I found certainly a lot in my book, is that when real estate agents are interacting with buyers, they don't like to talk about how they make money. And I think part of this is that they want to appear benevolent, right, to these people that they're providing a service for. So they're ingratiating themselves in all these ways. They take people out to lunch in between open houses. They give them gifts right when they close to generate referrals sort of down the line. They generally act as pretty friendly, and helpful people. And I think to some extent, a lot of this is genuine. I don't mean to say that these real estate agents are acting in bad faith. I think a lot of them are doing their work in ways that they think is appropriate. But analytically, right, I think it's interesting that these are the ways in which they kind of establish their expertise and authority over these people who are searching for houses. So after sort of showing that this process is one in which they start to build up a lot of authority over these clients that they have, I think they kick into high gear once the showing actually starts in a couple of ways. One is that they're very good at getting people to feel particular emotions during the search process. And part of this, I think, is an artifact of the housing market in New York at that time, where there's a lot of competition, prices are very high. And so they were really good at making people feel fearful, right? Fearful that they were not going to get an apartment or a house if they didn't make a high offer quickly, right? So they're telling people about how things are going like hotcakes on the market. They're providing them with data, so showing them that time on the market is shortening, that prices are going up. And so when they take them to a particular apartment that they think is well matched, they say, look, you got to make an offer really soon, and it's got to be a good one. Otherwise we're going to lose out and going to have to keep searching. But they're also really good, I think, at making people feel excitement about particular housing units, ones that agents think are really good matches, right? So, they'll find these individual characteristics about people, about their jobs, about the way they dress, their gender, their sexuality, their family, whatever it might be. And real estate agents, by and large, I think are pretty good at saying, like, look, this is the right neighborhood for you, or this is the right house for you, given your situation. Now, that's complicated by a lot of, I would just straight up racism in the market. But race more generally is this underlying thing that dictates sort of space in general. And I'll get back to this question of race in the market and discrimination towards the end. But just keep in mind, right, that there's this way to sort of say, here's the right place for you, right? And real estate agents are pretty good at convincing people that this is the right apartment or that's the right neighborhood. And then after they do this, one thing that I found that was really interesting is that at this time, everybody's offering more money than they think they're going to. All these buyers, they enter into this process, they say, okay, I think this is what I want to spend. And in all of the examples that I saw, people always end up spending more money than what they think they're going to. And part of this, I think, is a product of this market, right? One in which people are competing, right? And they're saying to themselves, oh, I really need to up my bid if I think up the amount that I think I need to pay for the kind of apartment that I want. But I do also think that there's something particular going on in interactions with real estate agents that's also driving prices up in a particular way. And the reason that I'm able to make this argument to some extent is that there's this big distinction between the ways real estate agents treat very rich people and the ways that they treat kind of everybody else. With very rich people, and here I'm talking about people who say they want to spend $1, $2, $5 million on an apartment, real estate agents are pretty good at avoiding talking about prices directly with these people. And when I ask these real estate agents, okay, why are you not talking about prices so much in terms of adjudicating units? These real estate agents said, well, rich people, I don't have to tell them about money. I don't have to tell them about valuation. They're rich. They know about money. They know about investing. They know about purchasing. With less wealthy people, agents were a little more direct. They would say, okay, I think this is the price that you have to pay. Obviously, less wealthy people have some limits too. If you're getting a mortgage, you have to get someone to appraise a unit and say, this is the right amount for it. Rich people tend to have a little more liquidity and can offer more. But in general, I think these patterns of interaction are fostering these different outcomes. And when real estate agents are really deferential on price to these very wealthy people, they more easily reorient them towards vastly more expensive units than what they originally thought they were going to buy. So they're not talking about prices with these rich people, but they take them to units that are priced twice as high as what they say they want to pay. And they say, well, look at this apartment. It's so much better than those things that we were looking at your price point, right? And I think because these rich people, to some extent, have the ability to pay more, they're easily reoriented towards thinking, well, I can pay more. Why not get the more expensive place? I do find, right, that less wealthy people end up paying more than what they say they want to, but at a margin way, way smaller, right, than what these really wealthy people, the difference between what they say they want to spend and what they actually spend. And this is obviously what leads to the book's title. So this process of upselling, I think, is really interesting. And I think it's really key for understanding neighborhood inequality. And that's the sort of note that I end the book on, right? Which is, why are neighborhoods so unequal? And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is housing prices, right? Housing prices are correlated with a lot of other resources that individuals who live in a particular place have, but they also dictate a lot of service provision, right? And neighborhood reputations, right? And what it means to live in a particular place. And so there's this aggregate sort of outcome, right, that happens when these real estate agents are doing all this upselling. And I think this is really key. And some of the models that I run try to show this to some extent in a quantitative way, which is I find that where real estate agents are, where they locate, where they do their work, these are neighborhoods that tend to have higher prices. That in and of itself is not so surprising, right? Real estate agents go where the money is, right? They want to go where commissions are. But I was also able to look at housing prices over a 5-year period. And what I found is that real estate agents, where they're located at the beginning of this 5-year period, those neighborhoods tend to have higher price increases 5 years later, right? So it's not just that real estate agents are located in higher price neighborhoods, it's that where they're located experience higher price increases in the aggregate over time. And I think that there's something about this upselling that they're doing in interaction that leads to these broader differences and these inequalities that are a result as a difference in these housing prices by neighborhood. And so I'll wind down, and I want to hear certainly what Ingrid and Bob have to say, but I'll just close with two things. One is that I think what some of the broader arguments of the book are that prices really matter, right, for understanding neighborhood inequality. But on a broader kind of theoretical level, our choices, even for something as consequential as a house, as big a deal for us as a house, as financially impactful as a house, they tend to be pretty malleable. What I found is that these market intermediaries, these real estate agents, right, actually affect our decisions in pretty profound ways. And they're pretty good, if they want to, at changing people's minds about how much they should pay and the neighborhoods in which they live, right? So it's, I think, one of the cool take homes to some extent, right, is to understand that choice is this thing that maybe emerges from these conversations, from these interactions with these market intermediaries who tend to have a lot of expertise and authority. And so not just in housing, but in lots of different kinds of markets, we should absolutely be thinking about who are the people that are giving us this advice, right? How are we reacting to it? How impactful is it? Because I think ultimately the answer is, we're not as certain about things as we often think we are. So why don't I stop there and we'll keep going.
Thanks, Max. And I realize as he's speaking that I was reluctant to let go of him. So I still claimed him as an NYU IPK fellow, and I neglected to tell you all that he's now an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which I guess we grudgingly accept, here in New York. But you have a very nice brick New York City background. He's also a Russell Sage Fellow for the year, so he didn't pick the right time to come back. But you're still a part of the city. It occurs to me as you're speaking that one interesting issue to discuss at some point is how we know whether it's the brokers who are shaping the process or just the experience of seeing lots of places, which maybe prospective home buyers don't do. I'm reminded of the book I wrote on online dating, when I learned that actually people in the dating market have no idea what they want in a person either. And it turns out that what we think we want going into the process is generally very different than what we have at the end of the process. So it'll be interesting to hear you talk about that later. Let's jump to Ingrid, who also has a nice New York City background of bookshelves behind
With
her.
your book back here. So there's probably one of Bob's books back there too. But so it's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation and about Max's book, which I think offers a really fascinating window into the world of real estate agents. And I think the book made me think a lot harder about the role that these intermediaries play in shaping housing outcomes. And then as a policy person, I can't help but thinking, the next question is sort of, okay, what can and should we do about that? Let me just start a little bit with sort of the normative question, which is, I think, Max argues in the book that agents basically get people to spend more than they would otherwise on housing. And as Eric just sort of suggested, right, agents, I think, would say, well, no, we don't do that, right? We're just helping people better understand the market, and that they're helping people optimize, right, by helping them understand the market, by helping them understand the set of available options, by even sort of helping them understand their own preferences, as Eric said, through sort of showing them more apartments and units. I tend to agree with you, Max, that agents probably push people to spend more than their optimal amount on housing, but I think it's very difficult to prove this, especially in the context of an appreciating market during this time in New York. But let's assume that agents do push people to spend too much. I think the next question is what margin agents are shifting. And I think you've sort of got 3 different margins in the book, and I'd love to sort of hear a little bit more about sort of which you think are the most important, right? The question is like, are they getting to people to buy larger homes with more amenities? Are they getting people to buy homes in more expensive neighborhoods? And are they getting people, or are they simply sort of discouraging people from negotiating as aggressively and try to sort of, get into the market quickly and as you said, I think just sort of like offer a good price, so they don't get priced out. So they're basically effectively paying more for the same home. And I think each of those suggests sort of a different set of potential social costs, right? And if it's mostly about encouraging these sort of higher income, mostly higher income white buyers to live in more expensive neighborhoods, then I think the problem is that these agents are helping to perpetuate segregation, and ultimately potentially sort of pushing, and you hinted this in your remarks, but it's in the book, sort of pushing these expensive neighborhoods kind of even further out of reach of those with lower incomes. So that's number one. If it's about buying larger, fancier homes, then, I mean, I feel like I'm channeling Bob a little bit, but this sort of may change norms about what an appropriate home is. And it may push others around them to feel like they too need to sort of stretch their budgets to buy a home of that size. And this is something I think that has been actually going on for decades in the US. I mean, that the average new home now in the United States that's constructed is 60% larger than it was just 40 years ago, and a lot fancier. And this brings environmental costs. It also brings, I think, economic risks as we sort of over-invest in housing and people are really teetering on the edge of not being able to afford. People are spending much more of their incomes on housing. I mean, much more than they were just a few decades ago. And I think, as Bob has written, this can also bring social costs as well, because people have these big, large, these huge, enormous homes and they never go outside. And this is particularly troublesome, I think, for kids, right? Who, instead of going to the playground, they play in their basement or wherever, and in their yard. So, and then, the third possibility is that agents are pushing people to move quickly in the market and pay higher prices for the same unit. And that, economists tend to dismiss that kind of, those kind of price effects, because it's sort of, well, the buyer's losing, but the seller wins. But I think, inflating prices at the high end of the market, I would argue, does have potential negative spillover effects in a market with limited supply, where you've got a fixed amount of land. It can lead to affordability challenges for those with lower incomes. So I think sort of, parsing out those mechanisms and what really is going on is important to think about, what we should do about this. But then, again, the next question is sort of what should we do about this? Let's assume that these agents are working on one or more of these margins. And I think there are really three different, the extremes of different kinds of approaches we could take. One is to work to just eliminate buyer's agents altogether, right? And in some ways, the market's doing this already. I mean, I was trying to look up online, trying to figure out, it's an interesting question, whether actually fewer people are relying on buyer's agents, whether the numbers of buyer agents are going down with the advent of Zillow and other electronic listing services. I expect the answer is yes, but I think that, in addition to price information, though, to agents' credit, I think that they are also potentially providing an important kind of consumer protection role. So when you have people buying, a really expensive good like housing that's characterized by high levels of asymmetric information, I mean, buyers are never going to know all the quirks and the flaws that a seller does about their house. And so I think that if we're going to eliminate buyer's agents, we need to figure out some way, maybe through lawyers, I'm not sure, to provide that kind of consumer protection function. And I'm more confident that Zillow is going to be able to take care of the information issue. Although even with sort of a heterogeneous good that doesn't transact that often, I mean, that it is difficult to get that pricing, but I'm not sure that an agent's going to be able to do that better than Zillow or some other algorithm. But second, I think the second thing we could do is, if we don't do away with agents, we could radically restructure their incentives to make them more aligned with those who are buying, right? And I don't know, I think this is actually a really, really interesting market design question. I really am not sure what the answer is. I tried to think about this a little bit. Surely we shouldn't be rewarding clients though if we shouldn't be rewarding agents if their clients pay more for the same house. So and finally, we could also regulate these agents more effectively. One of the sort of powerful sections of your book is this sort of really depressing descriptions of these fair housing trainings, which obviously are just sort of woefully inadequate. At best, they're woefully inadequate, and sort of cynical at worst. But I think there's a lot of I think there are ways to think about not only bolstering the enforcement of those laws, but also thinking about working to I think that, let me say this, I think agents actually have a lot of potential to broaden people's perspectives and broadens people's horizons and encourage them to consider a wider set of neighborhoods. And that can be something positive that agents actually do, kind of a, and we all tend to enter the housing market with really narrow blinders on, and people tend to look at a very limited set of neighborhoods based on their social networks. And so, maybe we could require agents to show everybody at least one home in a neighborhood where they're racially underrepresented, right? As a way to sort of, affirmatively further fair housing. We could adopt a kind of CRA approach, a Community Reinvestment Act approach to real estate agents, where we rate agencies, real estate brokerages based on the markets that they serve, pushing them not just to operate exclusively in the sort of wealthy white areas, which it sounded like a lot of your brokers were doing. And so I'm gonna leave it there for now, but like I said, I found the book very provocative, and I hope that I think it will provoke some important dialogue about policy responses. So thank you for writing it.
Thanks, Ingrid. I think you've just blown your chances of getting a nomination for the Republican Party mayoral candidate this year in New York, but I appreciate the serious engagement. Just before we move to Bob, I want to remind everyone that we're going to have a lot of time for a conversation and questions. So if you go down to, if you want to ask a question, some people are already jumping in on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. So please submit your questions there, and you can do it anytime. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks to you, Max. Max reached out to me and told me about the book some months back, and I was too tied up at the time to engage then, but then I got this nice invitation to participate on the panel, and I very much enjoyed reading the book. And one thing I especially appreciated about it was the fact that it's a decades-long project meant that he could, as he said in his summary comments, go back to buyers 4 or 5 years after they had actually gone through the experience of buying a house and get their reflections on how that experience had gone. I rarely recall seeing that much time after the transaction follow-up in other books, and so it was really refreshing to see that. Economists have long wondered why the real estate agent commission structure has survived as long as it has. I mean, it seems like if I use a realtor, it's because I'm worried that I won't be aware of a house that's for sale in time, and it'll be the right house for me and somebody else will buy it. That sounds like the kind of thing that a website could handle just fine. We could require inspections and other things to handle the asymmetric information problem. So it's still puzzling to me why we don't see, why we haven't seen a more complete disappearance of the buyer's agent. The sellers, that's a different story. You don't want to be home or go through the process of showing people around. You'd rather hire somebody to do that. But yeah, I'm surprised at the survival of the buyer's heirs. The issue of whether agents are performing their clients a disservice in what they tell them about or show them. You have on page 116, in the US, where you live shapes your life. And then you mention various ways in which it does that. It affects your health, your wealth, your well-being, the education of your kids, your safety, your economic mobility. Where you live is really important in those ways for how how your life unfolds. And I think it's true that we don't have a good, clear notion of what we like and what the possibilities are out there. And so I was reading much of what you had to say about agent behavior, listening to complaints from my economics colleagues who would say, "Oh, you're just helping people figure out what the right choice is for them. It's a huge choice. We have very little information about it the first time we're going through a choice like this." So the sense that agents aren't helping their clients by what they do to elucidate the various options out there before them, I can very easily imagine my economist colleagues worrying about that as a sort of a misleading impression. The the fact is, though, there are good responses to that. As a college student, I was a big fan of John Kenneth Galbraith. He had a critique of American consumer society. Basically, it was we spent far too much in the sphere of private consumption, and we invested way too little in the public sphere. I share that view to this day. I think it's a huge imbalance in American society. But his explanation for it was that we have people touting to us the benefits of private consumption. There are ads that bombard us hour by hour that tell us how much happier we'll be if we buy this product or that service. There is no corresponding source of advocacy on behalf of public investment. And so, of course, if people are showing you the gains you could have if you learn more about opportunities in one sector and nobody's carrying that ball in the other sector, there will be a distortion. You'll spend too much in one sector and not enough in another. Given the scale of the housing expense, it seems quite plausible to say that we're seeing exactly a version of Galbraith's concern in the housing market. The housing purchase is a huge share of your income. You don't know much about that. It's important to you. And you have very skillful, forceful advocates who are telling you how much better off you could be if you had a better house. Nobody's approaching you with the same kind of expertise and personal hands-on persuasive power in most other domains where you might spend your income. So yes, I think it's quite plausible, even given the economists' optimistic view about how well markets serve social welfare, that we would see a distortion on that account. There's another line of attack that you don't explore in the book. It's really kind of one that I've been pushing on for a long time in behavioral economics. There's a very big strand of behavioral economics that says people make cognitive errors. They're boundedly rational. They don't make decisions that serve their interests particularly well much of the time. My own view on that is that that's true and it's been well documented, but that if you're not making decisions that serve your own interests, there are lots of things you can do about that. The other main way in which we fall short of ideal spending allocations is that we face important collective action problems in our decisions. And I know in your sample you didn't have too many people who had young children and were shopping therefore for schools, but I think that's even in the minds of people who don't yet have children, a very big issue in the selection of a house. Everywhere in the world, even in France, where the school budgets are the same in every school all around the country, and every school is on the same page of the same national curriculum, people want their kids to go to the schools that are located in the more expensive neighborhoods because those schools are better. The kids come from advantaged circumstances. They're prepared to learn and advance more quickly. So if you're an average parent in the income distribution, you're right in the middle, and your ambition is just to send your kid to a school of average quality, I think we'd think ill of you as a parent if you didn't have at least that ambition for your kids, then what must you do? You must muster the average priced house for your area. And if others spend more and you don't spend more, your kids will go to the schools with the metal detectors out front and where the other students score in the 15th and 20th percentiles in reading and math, and nobody wants that. So when you talk about the shifting patterns in the housing market, I think really we have a very economical, simple explanation for most of what we've seen, which is that they have tracked very closely the changes in income growth patterns. After World War II, incomes grew at the same 3%, roughly 3% rate up and down the income ladder. Since the early 1970s, it's been a completely different pattern of growth. It's been almost all of the significant income gains accruing to people at the top of the income ladder. And the higher up you go, the bigger the gains. And there, I think I'm not worried about the wealthy at all. I mean, when you're talking about the true wealthy, they're not going to spend as much as they've got anyway. So if they've got an expert showing them exciting new options that they hadn't thought of, the effect will be they'll buy a house that does make them happier because they bought it rather than the cheaper one. Maybe they'd be happier still if they had other people encouraging them to explore what exciting discoveries lay dormant in the field of wines or travel or a host of other areas, but it's not going to hurt them that they're spending more on housing. Who it hurts is the people below them. The people at the top build bigger, and here Ingrid referred to this. They don't cause any pain for the people in the middle directly. The people in the middle like to see the pictures of the houses at the top and see footage of them on TV. What they affect is the people just one rung down. They really form their own impressions of what kind of house they need by the houses of the people in their own social circles. They build bigger, the people just below them build bigger. And Ingrid mentioned that the footprint of the house in the middle has grown 50, 60, 70% over the past decades. That's the short answer as to why. And that's put an enormous strain on the budgets of people in the middle. And there are things we need to do. I mean, I've been a long advocate of a progressive consumption tax. We could slow spending at the top. We know people in New York live in smaller units than people in cities where the price of real estate is lower. If we taxed consumption at the margin at high rates for people who are spending a lot, we could slow that. We could make the social safety net better. There are a whole lot of things we could do, but basically it's the change in income growth patterns that's explaining a lot of this. Again, very much enjoyed the chance to see the housing market at ground level. Yeah, we don't, as economists, we rarely get to see studies that take us inside the box, and I always enjoy narratives and ethnographies of that sort a whole lot.
Thanks, Bob. We have a bunch of questions already, but before we get to them, Max, I wonder if you want to, have some quick responses to anything that Ingrid or Bob said.
Yeah, just real quick, right? I mean, I think, Ingrid brought up something that is a theme in the book that I didn't really talk too much about, which is segregation, right? Which is that there's this, and it relates to, I think, what Bob was talking about towards the end too, about this sort of cascading effect. And this is what I'm, I think of sort of Ingrid's menu of where I think the problem actually kind of lies. I think this is where it is, right? Which is that this pressure, right, that Bob's talking about, at sort of not quite at the super top, right, but at the, the upper middle, right, is doing this work, right, on the one hand, and, what Ingrid mentioned, these price explosions at a spatial level, right, is doing this work as well, which is that some places become super rarefied, right, wealth tracks with race in this country, right, so that means that places are more and more segregated, both by income and also by race, ethnicity, ethno-racial identity. But I do think, right, that this is creating the collective action problem, right, that Bob is talking about, where there is, I mean, if anyone who, and this isn't New York in particular, but it's maybe especially pronounced here, right, of anyone who lives in New York, which is that you're bombarded all the time by images of apartments in media, in the newspaper. There's an entire section of the New York Times, right, dedicated to telling you that you could, if you had the money, right, live in, this neighborhood or that neighborhood or this kind of house with these kinds of amenities. And so, I think both are at work here. And then the last thing I do want to talk a little bit about, because it's become a little more prominent as the book, since the book has been published, is Ingrid's question about policy, right? Like what actually is to be done here. And I've been thinking about this question a lot. And I think Ingrid is totally right that there is this consumer protection benefit, right, to using real estate agents. Real estate agents are doing this work, and by and large, I think most of the people that I interviewed for this book and that I followed around, I think they're not doing anything actively, consciously bad, right? I think it's their structural position is such that they have to do their work in a particular way. They need to make money, right? So they're sort of moving people along, right? So I certainly don't mean to say that they're not, and everyone always asks me would I use a real estate agent, and I think the answer is yes, probably, if I were buying a house. I think they do this service. And so what's to be done, I think, is really the two things that Ingrid mentioned. One is change their incentives, absolutely, right? Which is that, and Bob mentioned this too, the commission structure right now is this artifact essentially of a monopoly, right? Or of in the early 1900s, where a bunch of real estate boards got together and said, this is how we're going to do it, and you can't participate if you don't agree to this 6% thing. And it's stuck around, right? And I do think that if we changed that, there would be a lot of different outcomes. But then to this question of regulation, right, which is that Ingrid pointed out in the book, I document that there's this really, agents really don't have to learn a lot to become, you really don't have to learn a lot to become a real estate agent, right? And I do think that if real estate agents knew more about what the impacts of where people live are, what segregation is, right? How it's a historical outcome of a lot of different processes at the federal level, at city level, sort of in racism within society. I think they would maybe more consciously be thinking about these alternatives, whether it's mandating them to show in neighborhoods where the consumer is a racial minority. Or I think, Maria Kreisen and Kyle Kreider have a book from a few years ago about segregation, where their big advocacy is that neighborhoods that are integrated need to be more prominent, right? In a way that there needs to be, real estate agents need to do this boostering work, not just of any neighborhood where they're showing people houses, but particularly of integrated neighborhoods. And so there is something in terms of regulation. A CRA approach could be great. The other thing that I've been thinking is something similar to HMDA, which is that there's a federal law right now that mortgage brokers have to report all this data to the federal government. Real estate agents don't. Real estate agents don't have to tell anybody about who they're dealing with, what the race of the people they're dealing with is, or the money, that's transacting. And I think if we just had more data, right, in an aggregate sense, that would certainly improve efforts towards regulation too. I know we've only got about 10 minutes, so why don't I open it up for questions?
So I got a bunch of questions for you that are going to fill the rest of the time already. And one of the great things about doing this all on Zoom is that the questions don't come with 5-minute preambles. So we're going to get right to it. And you can just answer efficiently, and maybe we can get everybody in. And the first question is from our old friend and colleague, Zawadi Rux Hidiana, who wants to know, she says that upselling suggests implications for the role of real estate agents in the gentrification and super gentrification process. Can you talk to that more specifically, and how do real estate agents play a role in that?
Yeah, so just real quick, right? It's a theme, in some parts of the book, because I am looking at real estate agents in neighborhoods that are gentrifying. I think to some extent this is a, city-based question. New York is a place where gentrification is a thing that is happening, right? Regardless, depending on how you define it. And real estate agents are pretty good at selling neighborhoods that are in flux, right? Selling neighborhoods that are changing. And just to give you an example, I had this real estate agent tell me basically that as you go farther east in Brooklyn, right? They basically told me, here's where I basically stopped showing houses to white people. But then when I talked to this person a year later, that had moved, right? That it had gone farther east, right? And so this is just to say that real estate agents are aware of sort of the racial dynamics of these neighborhoods. And I think, while they're pretty good at not trying to communicate those to their clients, it's certainly affecting what they're doing. And I think in neighborhoods that are already changing, real estate agents are probably doing more work to perpetuate it than prevent it.
I mean, the possible consequence of Ingrid's policy idea, right, of making sure everybody shows a place to someone, from different racial group, is that speeds up the gentrification process, right? Because that's exactly what happened. Tom DeBrosio wants to know, I think you don't have the answer to this question though, what % on average does upselling add to the price of a home? And does the effect vary widely across the US? If you don't know, we can move on, but maybe.
Right, no, just to be clear, right, when I'm talking about upselling, right, what the referent numbers are what people say they want to spend versus what they actually spend, right? Not the actual numbers on any particular unit. That I think is actually a really fascinating question that I think is like for someone else's dissertation. Yeah, I don't, that's not something I'm.
So Joshua Rosenberg throws you a high five on the book, and he says, your research shows that areas with more real estate agents experience greater margins of upselling. How do we combat this? And he said things without decommodifying housing or eliminating agents, the market's going to be dictated by agents and their livelihoods rely on selling homes for more. So how are you going to curb that process?
Yeah, I mean, if I could wave my wand and decommodify all housing, I probably would. But I think a more realistic sort of a way of thinking about this is that going back to what Ingrid said about changing real estate agents' incentives. And what has been shown, right, is that people who don't use for-profit real estate agents, and these tend to be lower income people, but people who use housing counselors and other services actually tend to find housing that they're more satisfied with in more integrated neighborhoods that they live in for longer periods of time, right? So removing some kind of profit motive or restructuring the profit motive of this work, I think actually would go a long way towards making sure that some of the bad, sort of what we would say are sort of the negative effects of this work might be reduced.
So Kathleen Buig wants to know what % of real estate agents are of color, and how much does it matter in terms of fairness of housing opportunity for people of color to have a real estate agent who looks like them and understands them?
That's a great question, and I can't say with any certainty about the benefit of having a same-race agent or not. What I can say is that real estate agents and their clients usually tend to be same-raced, right? And that's true both at the individual level and then also at the spatial level. So white agents tend to work in white neighborhoods with white clients. Black agents tend to work with Black clients in Black neighborhoods. And there is some research that shows that there is obviously a commission difference, right? Because Black neighborhoods tend to be valued less relative to white neighborhoods. And so Black agents are often missing out on the profit aspects of this work. And it's something that I do talk a little bit about in the book, that there are these real estate agents of color who know this, right? It's a very clear and apparent aspect of their work. And they're trying in some ways to move, right, their offices to be doing more work in white neighborhoods. And it's part and parcel of this broader problem of where the incentives are.
So Zenaida Osorio wants to know if you could tell us about results you found from how people talk about the houses and the role of language, specifically in transaction or buying or selling a house.
Yeah, I mean, language, sort of conversation is where I locate a lot of this upselling and locate sort of a lot of what this dynamic is like. And, I will say, right, there's plenty of examples in the book, but, just to sort of give you a more concrete one, agents will say things to certain kinds of clients that they won't say to other kinds of clients. So to women, they'll talk about, how nice it is to have a house where they can have kids. Or that a room can be converted into a second bedroom or a third bedroom if a child is on the way. And they don't tend to say these things to men, right? And so how real estate agents are talking about these houses and neighborhoods, I think, is actually where the action is.
Scott St. Martin says the landlord, owner, developer, broker relationship in New York City is such a driver of this market, and major public PE-owned national firms exist alongside one or two agent mom and pop shops on both sides of that equation. How much differentiation was there in the agents you worked with?
Yeah, well, I think there's differences in agents in terms of their market position, right? Agents who are working at the high end are in some ways different than agents who are working at the lower end, not just in terms of the money that they're making. But I think this question is actually hitting on something that I think is a really important sort of question, not necessarily for me, but moving forward, right? Which is that after the Great Recession, there was a lot of consolidation of housing stock. Mom and pop landlords are tend to be on the downswing, especially after economic depressions, and we're having more corporate landlords. And there is some evidence that this has bad effects, right, for renters, right? Corporate landlords tend to evict more, they tend to charge more, and so something I think for housing scholars absolutely to be on the lookout for in the fallout of this COVID-19 recession is that we're probably going to see something similar moving forward.
So Adam Hayes says, Max, you mentioned that realtors disparage Zillow and similar website value estimates. So Adam's got two questions. First, brokers are thought of as providing information to buyers and sellers, but in this role, they also filter and discount certain information. I don't know, that doesn't seem to be a question.
Well, hey, Adam, yeah.
Second, despite this disparagement, do you think that there's nonetheless a sort of performative effect where Zillow prices bring about the ultimate transaction prices?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I was not thinking about when I was doing this work, right? Which is that, but it is something that I am thinking about now, which is I'm about to implement a survey with renters and home buyers looking at which sources of information they trust more. Do they trust Zillow on prices more than they trust real estate agents, more than they trust their parent, more than they trust their mortgage broker or whomever? In terms of the actual effect, right, where it actually ended up closer, I can't say, but I think that's actually that's a really cool question.
The last thing is not a question, but a little bit of praise
I'll welcome that.
From Andrew. Well, don't get used to it, man. From Andrew Stanley, who says, thanks to you, Max, we've introduced S2525 in New York just for such data aggregation. So that's, sociology for the people, having an impact right away, which is the way we like to do it at IPK. So Andrew, thank you for telling us that. Hey, so we like to keep these Zoom events to an hour. And I can tell you that we basically have the same number of people here now that we had when we started, which is a really good sign that the format's working, and that this is a great conversation. We have 2 minutes left, which is perfect because I sent on the chat a link to Max's book at the University of Chicago Press website. And if you go through there, I'm sure you can order the book, and Max can go check his Amazon rating now and then again in an hour. And we can get it, if all 70 of us buy the book now, we could probably get it to 100,000, 10,000, maybe. Yeah. 70 people buying a book in an hour probably gets it to the top 100. Wouldn't you say, Bob?
Yeah, it definitely gets it to 75. Yeah.
So Max is going to be sitting by his computer, manically checking the Amazon, like the last scene of The Social Network, for the next hour. We can't thank him in person, but I hope you'll all join me in thanking Bob and Ingrid for such sharp, incisive comments, and Sam and Zari and Jessica Coffey for helping to organize this event. And let's all send Max off into the night, by congratulating him for this really wonderful contribution to the study of sociology and economics and the way housing works.
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it.
See y'all back here soon.